Okay, we're now on video 3 of 3. Yet again, had a tech problem. So I'm not taking any chances, and I'm going to try to wrap this up as quickly as possible. So this is video 3 of 3 for this week. And I just want to pick up with where we left off. I was in the middle of talking about the economy and society in Virginia as a tobacco colony. Again, still on the slide that's entitled Economy and Society in the Chesapeake. As I was saying before, my computer camera so rudely interrupted me. The nature of tobacco production meant that the social structure of Virginia developed in a very unnatural way, by which I mean that male laborers were highly desired by plantation owners in early Virginia, and therefore men came to, as you can see, vastly outnumber women in the colony. How much so? In the 1620s in Virginia, on average, there were 3 to 4 men for every woman. So let's say 3.5 men to every 1 woman, which, as we all know, is unnatural, right? Humans tend to reproduce in roughly the same numbers, men and women, gender-wise. This was not the case in early Virginia. So this created a very volatile colony. For one thing, many of the men that came to Virginia were young men who were unmarried, who came as servants, and that's going to be a subject for the next slide. So I won't talk too much about it here, but young unmarried men coming to Virginia, working in the very difficult and tiring labor of tobacco plantations without much of an opportunity to meet and potentially marry a woman and start a family. The irony is that this actually gave women, as you can see in the second point called Women in the Family, much more independence than was typically the case in England, the mother country, or as we'll see in other parts of English North America, most significantly New England. Now, I say that this is ironic because it was not an intended consequence. The leaders of Virginia did not intend to create a society in which women had more economic independence than they would have elsewhere in England or even in Europe. But it did occur because of the unique dynamics of this tobacco colony. And the way in which women actually gain this economic independence is through at the very last point at the bottom of the slide, constant cycle of deaths and remarriage that occurred in early Virginia. So what that meant in practice is that typically what happened is that unmarried women in Virginia, those who either emigrated to Virginia or were born in Virginia, tended to marry much older men who were established, typically established tobacco planters who owned plantations, who would die much earlier, or before, I should say, their younger wives. These women, upon being widowed, would come to control some of the property of their late husband through inheritance. They would often remarry, often would become widowed again, perhaps become married again, and become widowed again, so that women often cycle through several different marriages, along the way gaining access to property through inheriting it from deceased husbands to a degree that women did not have the opportunity to do so or to do in England. So women had much more of a right to make their own legal contracts and business contracts. They had a much clearer right, which they embraced, to conduct business. And they, as you can see, sometimes came to administer states. So this is much more economic independence for women in general, except for women who are indentured servants. And again, I'll talk about that on the next slide. So this is unique to Virginia. And again, as I said, ironic because it was not an intended consequence. So now I want to transition and wrap up this video 3 of 3, goodness gracious, by discussing labor in the Chesapeake, really the kind of keystone to understanding the significance of early Virginia to North American history, in many ways all the way until today. Because the labor patterns that we see emerge in Virginia, first indentured servitude, and you can go ahead and scroll down to the slide called Labor in Chesapeake. Later, African slavery came to predominate in much of British colonial North America, especially African slavery, and would be the foundations for the very large and complex system of slavery that would emerge eventually in the independent United States, which we'll get to later in the semester. So, as I said, the very first labor force that planters relied upon as Virginia transitioned into becoming a tobacco colony were servants, indentured servants. And it's likely that you've heard this term before, and you may have learned about indentured servitude in previous classes. But in short, what indentured servitude was contract labor, meaning that the labor system in which servants, workers, agreed to serve a master for a period usually lasting from 4 to 7 years in exchange for passage to Virginia. So indentured servants came from the mother country, from England, Ireland, and eventually Scotland and Wales, Great Britain. They received paid passage to Virginia, which was very expensive, in exchange for which they had to serve a master under a labor contract for a period of 4 to 7 years. These labor contracts gave masters extraordinary power over servants. To just give a couple of examples to you. Masters for this period, 4 to 7 years, depending on the individual contract, had complete and total control over the labor of that person. And usually that meant, in the case of really Virginia, servants forcibly working upon tobacco plantations in backbreaking, sweltering humid conditions. Masters, as per these contracts, also were given extraordinary control over the daily lives outside of work of their servants. So in most indentured servitude contracts, there are clauses about behavior, specifically clauses that prevent servants from gambling, for example. Usually there were clauses that prevented servants from going to taverns, going drinking. There were usually in indentured servitude contracts, there were prohibitions against fornicating. So sexual relations were usually banned as per these indentured servitude contracts. So masters, in fact, had a right to prevent their servants from engaging in sexual relations as per these contracts. Servants often, upon coming to Virginia and experiencing tobacco labor, indentured servitude on tobacco plantations, often attempted to escape, and masters had legal rights to recover fugitive servants. And punishments ranged from, for first infractions, physical beating, and perhaps an extension of their contract, all the way to physical mutilation. What was often common for indentured servants who ran away repeatedly was that they would be branded with a hot iron on their forehead or on their cheek, most often a brand with the letter R, which would stand for runaway, so that people in the community would know that that person was either a runaway servant or had at some point been a servant who ran away frequently enough that they shouldn't be trusted. In short, indentured servitude was a miserable life. And we know this from letters that early indentured servants, if they were literate, wrote to family members back in England, in which they say nothing positive about being an indentured servant and complain about the treatment. Almost always complained about a lack of food, something that was common. But this was the dominant or the predominant labor form in early Virginia, all the way through the 1660s and 1670s. What began to happen are two interconnected developments that ultimately would lead to a shift towards Virginia planters beginning to utilize enslaved laborers from the African continent. The first was that indentured servants, by the middle of the 17th century, began to live long enough to serve out their contracts. In the 1620s, in the 1630s, even the 1640s, indentured servants, about 50% of indentured servants, I should say, died before their contracts were finished because of disease or maltreatment, usually both. As this began to happen, what we begin to see are a larger number of freed servants being released out into freedom in Virginia, only to find that their economic opportunities were limited. And I'm going to come back to that point when we get down to the very last point about Bacon's Rebellion. But even in the earliest stages of Virginia's history, we begin to see the slow introduction of African slaves, meaning slaves from the African continent, that over time would eventually become the predominant labor force and the center, the pillar of Virginia society. Now, the first introduction of enslaved people from Africa was recorded in Virginia in 1619. And that quotation you see there is a phrase taken from the diary of John Rolfe, an early Virginia colonist, the man who actually married Pocahontas, which is discussed in the movie Pocahontas. In 1619, he recorded very briefly that today a Dutch ship, so ship owned by ship owners in the Netherlands, came and docked in Jamestown and traded with Jamestown 20 and odd, meaning around 20 enslaved people from Africa in exchange for food and water. And so this is the first introduction of enslaved people from Africa into Virginia, the year 1619. And if you're familiar, actually, last year, 2019, the New York Times published a very popular and in some ways controversial special issue that's called 1619, about the history of slavery and African American history in the United States. It's called 1619 because this was the first introduction of enslaved people into an English colony in North America. Actually, enslaved people had been brought to North America earlier to what is today Florida, which was settled by the Spanish. But 1619, the first introduction of enslaved people into what is now the United States. And getting down to the second subpoint, slavery and the chattel principle, what we want to do here is just distinguish, be very clear about the difference between servitude and slavery, indentured servitude and enslavement, because in many respects they can seem similar, but they were fundamentally different. And it's not just about racial distinction, meaning indentured servitudes were primarily white from England, Ireland, Scotland, Wales, and enslaved people from the African continent tended to have darker skin. That is true, and slavery would become racialized, identified with dark skin eventually. But in the early stages of this history, the history of slavery in the Chesapeake, eventually the United States, what distinguished slavery from servitude is called the chattel principle. And you can see that word there, C-H-A-T-T-E-L. What that means is that the fundamental difference between a servant and a slave was that a slave was owned as the private property, and the legal word for that is chattel property, of the master. The body of the enslaved person, their physical being itself, was owned by the master. Whereas under indentured servitude, what was owned was the labor power of the servant. So another way of thinking about that is that servants had limited, yes, but rights as human beings under the law of Virginia and under the law of England that enslaved people from Africa did not. Legally speaking, technically speaking, for just looking at law and legal definitions, enslaved people from Africa were technically not people. Of course, they were human beings. And that goes almost without saying, but legally speaking, slaves were property, whereas servants were, legally speaking, people. And what we begin to see in Virginia, especially in the 1660s, is the development of law, the passage by this House of Burgesses, which we saw in the second slide, the passage of law which begins to make clear distinctions between enslaved people and servants, and begins to identify skin color with enslavement. Before the 1660s, it was rare but possible for a person with dark skin from Africa to themselves be a slave owner. Not every single person in the early history of Virginia who was brought to Virginia who was of African descent was automatically a slave. Some were brought as servants who then gained their freedom and themselves become slave owners. And the most famous example of this, and this is discussed in chapter 3 of American Yop, so we'll read that next week, is a story of a man the English called Anthony Johnson, who was from what is today the country of Angola, which is in southwestern Africa, who had come at some point in the 1620s to Virginia as a servant, but who gained freedom and himself became a slaveholder. But beginning in the 1660s, what we begin to see with the slave law is the clear distinguishing between slavery and servitude and race and servitude. So, for example, one of these slave laws that I might point to was from the year 1662. It doesn't say anything specifically about race, but this would become the foundations of a racialized slavery. In 1662, the Virginia House of Burgesses passed a law stating that from this point forward, if a child is born to an enslaved mother, that child would be born a slave themselves. Whereas before that, regardless of who the mother was, a child would inherit the status of the father. Why? This was the Virginia House of Burgesses, elite white male slaveholders, primarily, passing a law which allowed them to own as property children of enslaved mothers from the beginning of that child's life. Now, this was a law that was applied only to enslaved women and the children of enslaved women. Nothing comparable was passed that applied to white servants. Another law I might point to from the year 1667 stated that baptism into Christianity would no longer be an avenue towards freedom. And this was applied specifically to people from the African continent, most of whom came to Virginia not as Christians, but who before 1667, by becoming baptized into Christianity, received their freedom on that basis. So we're beginning to see with these slave laws a construction of slavery and its identification with race. So that by the 1670s and the 1680s, getting down to this last point, we see a fundamental transition from servitude to slavery. Okay, and we see this in the form of Bacon's Rebellion, our last point for today, which occurred in the years 1675 and 1676. Now, this rebellion emerged not necessarily out of the relations of African slavery in Virginia, but because a growing class conflict between former indentured servants who were poor and elite plantation owners burst into class conflict. Poor former servants feeling that they were being oppressed by the elite ruling class of Virginia. In 1675 and 1676 broke into open rebellion, leading to Bacon's Rebellion, Bacon being the last name of the man who led it. This rebellion was put down. The elite, led by the royal governor of the colony, Governor Berkeley, were able to put down this rebellion of poor former servants. But the fundamental transition began to occur in which we see, especially by the 1680s, a shift away from using indentured servants who someday could become free. See plantation owners emphasizing the use of African and slave labor, because the fundamental difference between the servant and the slave is that the servant, as a contract laborer, would expect to become free, whereas an African slave would be enslaved for life. And in the case of children born to enslaved women, their children would be born slaves for life as well. So I'll stop here. This is video 3 of 3. I will see you all next week. As I said, next week we have no class on Monday. That's Labor Day. We'll have a Zoom session on Wednesday. I'll send emails to you to let you know about that. This week, today is Tuesday, September the 1st. On Wednesday, September the 2nd, I'm going to post our first discussion prompt, and you have 2 days to respond to it. You can skip this one if you want, as long as you remember that you need to complete 10 over the course of the semester. Okay, so I'm going to sign off, and I will see you all through Zoom on next Wednesday. Okay, thank you.